So I thought I'd talk today about a question that I get from time to time and is something that seems to puzzle people when they approach poetry. And this is the subject of indentation of lines in poems. Now, indentation is something that's pretty straightforward when we're writing prose. When we're writing paragraphs, we know that we want to start a new paragraph, so we indent the first line. You know, people argue about if it should be half an inch or a quarter of an inch. I personally think a quarter of an inch looks a little nicer. But when it comes to poetry, if you flip open a book of poems, I have Longfellow's selected poems right here. And if you open a page of poetry, you see, look, some of those lines are indented, some of them aren't. So what's going on? Well, there are many reasons why a poet might indent a line of poetry. The first reason, and you see this in older poetry, say especially Paradise Lost, or the longer poems of William Wordsworth. Sometimes a poet will indent a line of a poem for the same reason that the prose writer will, because they want to start a new section, but they don't want to put a whole stanza break. So sometimes when people look at Milton's Paradise Lost, if you flip through any book of Paradise Lost, there are no stanza breaks where there's like a space in between the end of one stanza and the beginning of another. There's just an indentation of a line which indicates a new verse paragraph has begun. Now, the word verse paragraph is almost an oxymoron because in verse you have stanzas and in prose you have paragraphs. But this is one of the reasons why sometimes poets indent, because they're kind of imitating the indentation of the beginning of a new section that you'd find in prose. But usually that's not the case. Usually when a poet is indenting a line, say in A Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, usually the reason is because they want to highlight the difference between certain lines which are admitting of one particular pattern and others which are showing a different pattern. And so if you look at indented lines throughout a poem, if there's a regular indentation variation, usually you'll find that there's some sort of pattern that the indented lines are following that the non-indented lines aren't following. So in Psalm of Life, it's the second and fourth line of each stanza that is indented. And if you count up the syllables, you'll find that the second and fourth lines of each stanza are one syllable shorter than the first and third lines. And so the indentation is indicating these lines are a little shorter. Also, there's an A-B rhyme scheme going on. And so the B rhymes are indented, whereas the A rhymes aren't. So we have, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not as they seem. So that's 4 lines. And if you listen to the rhythm of those lines, you'll notice the first and the third line are da-da, 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 da-da. That's iambic tetrameter. But the second and fourth lines are da-da, 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 da. It's one syllable shorter. These shorter lines are highlighted by the indentation. Sometimes you'll get very wild indentation that you'll wonder, why are so many lines indented at so many different places? Well, one of the reasons for that is that there's different line lengths. So here is a poem by Longfellow called Snowflakes. You'll see that there are 3 levels of indentation there. The third and most indented level are the shortest lines. The longest lines are the least indented. But that's not always the case. Sometimes a poet might just indent a line for fun, to create a interesting visual pattern on the page that doesn't correspond to differences in line patterns. Usually they will, and if you're dealing with poetry published, say, before 1915, 1920, usually indentation will follow some sort of patterning in rhyme or line length. After 1915, 1920, when the modernist movement starts, you start to get a little bit more freedom and expressive-ness with indentation, where the indentation might be expressing that there's some cool new thought that needs to be set off from the other lines by indentation, not because the metrical system or rhyme system requires it, because the thought system requires it. And you'll see this a lot in modernist poetry. So here is an example of a poem that uses indentation not to highlight a difference in meter or rhyme scheme, but to highlight the setting off of or highlighting of the image or thought that's being expressed. So this is Gwendolyn Brooks' To Be in Love, and you see that the first line of the first stanza and then the second two lines of the third stanza are indented. That's not because they have a different rhyme scheme or because they're conspicuously longer or shorter than the other lines. It's Brooks trying to set aside that image. If you see those second two lines of the third stanza reads, "You look at things through his eyes. A cardinal is red. A sky is blue. Suddenly you know he knows too." That a cardinal is red, a sky is blue are more detailed examples of what's being described in the non-indented lines. And so those indented lines kind of set off an idea. And as I mentioned, you start to see this more and more after the modernist turn in literature, both in American literature and British literature and elsewhere. A final reason a poet might indent a line is actually to show that it belongs to the line before it. Sometimes you'll see this in an otherwise unindented poem. If you have a particularly long line, sometimes you'll have a shorter line after it that's indented but not capitalized. That just shows, oh, this line was too long and we have to kind of wrap it around for, publishing on the page purposes. So, we've gone over the main reasons a poet might indent a line, but I think one of the things about poetry that we need to acknowledge is poets are always trying to be inventive in some way, especially inventive in relation to the tradition. And so I'm sure that there are reasons to indent a line that poets have that we haven't covered here. When you read poetry, do you like when lines are indented? Do you not like when lines are indented? Pay attention next time you're reading a poem where some lines are indented and some aren't, to what is this highlighting? What is this showing about the difference between this line and the lines that aren't indented? If there are maybe several levels of indentation, think about what do the different levels of indentation represent when it comes to movements of the poem, focuses on ideas or formal constructions. Have fun out there. Pay closer and closer attention to the poetry you read and ask questions of it. If it's good poetry, it will help answer those questions and illuminate more and more of what the poet is communicating. Thanks.